Hi, greetings everyone. It's Naomi Wolf again with Outspoken. Little Loki's on my lap as usual, and I have an amazing guest, a thrill, like I'm literally thrilled. I can barely contain myself. Welcome, Carolyn Jane Knight.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here.
It's so good to be here. Carolyn Jane Knight is the last. It's so good to have you here. See, I'm like so flustered. I'm literally blushing. And I just want to say, I have interviewed heads of state, famous writers, famous actors, famous this, famous that. I rarely get actual like fangirl jitters, but everything you are and represent and your lineage makes me like overwhelmed with joy and nervousness in interviewing you. So just know that, and everyone bear with me because I'm going to get through it. I'm just like so thrilled I can barely think. Carolyn Jane Knight is the last of Jane Austen's nieces to grow up where Jane Austen lived and wrote her most famous works. Carolyn Jane Knight is Jane Austen's fifth great niece and the last of Jane's nieces to grow up at Chawton House on the ancestral estate where Jane Austen lived and wrote, preserving and sharing her family's irreplaceable heritage for future generations. Carolyn Jane Knight is the last one and to grow up at Chawton House, as I mentioned. As this generation's family voice, Carolyn preserves and shares Jane Austen's family heritage through speaking events worldwide, her weekly Jane Austen's Niece Stories, I love that title, her memoir Jane and Me, My Austen Heritage, Chawton tours in the summer, and exhibitions of family artifacts. Carolyn is creating the Austen family's Chawton archive, documenting memories, digitizing photographs and artifacts, and preserving the most comprehensive record of daily life at Chawton House for Janeites, historians, and future generations. She's also founder and chair of the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation, supporting literacy projects globally. That is just so extraordinary. She was inspired at 18 to build her own path. She spent 25 years in international business, ultimately serving as CEO, leading marketing agency organizations globally before returning to her family's heritage work. So a very varied life. You've worn many hats, and now to our great good fortune, you've returned from the world of global, CEO-ship and leading marketing entities to come back to your childhood home, Chawton House, and Austen's home, to make sure that the future, scholars of the future, fans of the future, readers of the future, English people of the future, I should also say, people from all over the world have access to what is essentially now a time capsule, right? So tell me about Chawton House. Start with that.
So Chawton House, and thank you very much for the very, very nice introduction. So Chawton House was built in 1585 by a chap called John Knight, and it's never been sold. It is still owned by my family. And actually the Chawton estate has been sold once in 1,000 years since the Norman Conquest. And that's when the Knight family bought it in the middle of the 16th century. And as I said, Chawton House was built by John Knight. And I grew up believing, because I was lucky enough to grow up there, and we're talking about number of bedrooms is difficult to kind of count. But if you were to count,
I love that sentence.
Only because
we all say things like that.
There's changes, there's been changes over the years, and there's rooms that you don't know if they were originally bedrooms or not. But we're in the 20 plus in the kind of bedroom area, and we're talking about a big Elizabethan, gorgeous oak panelled manor house. And I grew up believing that John Knight was my 14th great grandfather. Mm-hmm. But the actual truth of the matter is we're not related at all. And we're not related because it looks like there's 16, I'm 17th generation. It looks like there's 17 unbroken generations of Knight family that have owned this home. Mm. But out of the 16 squires, so we're on our 16th now, 16th owner, 8 times there hasn't been children. The squire hasn't had children. So 50% of the time, because obviously years ago, if you couldn't have kids, that was the end of it, wasn't it? I mean, there was nothing that could be done.
Right.
So on those occasions, an heir had to be found, and the heir, or appointed, chosen, and the heir was always a relation. Mm. But sometimes people may have inherited from, say, their mother's side of the family, but given it to someone on their father's side.
Okay.
So they're related to both of those
I
people,
see.
but they're not related to each other.
I
There's
see.
actually, that breaks the bloodline doing that.
I
And
see.
if you think about, you know, you've got cousins, I'm sure, on both sides of your family. You're related to both, but they're not related to each other.
I understand what you just said. So is it coincidence that your last name is Knight?
No.
Okay.
Every time the house is passed down through the generations, if your name isn't Knight, you have to change it to Knight to be able to inherit Chawton.
Wow.
Now that's partly because we're talking about a system where your status in the country, your wealth, your standing with the king, how much favour you were going to get, what political roles you might get the opportunity to fulfil, all of those sorts of things were down to, you know, as I said, your wealth, your family brand, how and things like coats of arms and names and all of those sorts of things were just part of the brand, is how I kind of think about it. So it was important to keep them, and I don't think Chawton is remotely unusual in that. And there will be other 500-year-old sort of, you know, lineages like this that appear to be consistent, but they're not. Well, I mean, I'm sure there are some, but you know, with that many generations.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I mean, you could argue that family is family, but I understand you're saying you're not, that the lineage is not an unbroken blood descent.
So twice we've had broken bloodlines. The second time was at the end of the 18th century, when Thomas Knight realised that him and his wife Catherine were not going to have children. They owned Chawton, Godmersham Park, which is in Kent, another very big grand estate, and they owned Steventon, where Jane Austen lived, where Jane Austen grew up. She grew up in property owned by the Knight family. She spent the first 26 years of her life growing up in property owned by Thomas Knight.
Right.
When Thomas and Catherine realised they weren't going to have children, they needed to choose their heir. Right. And they chose Edward Austen, being Jane's brother. The Austens and the Knights are third or fourth cousins. So, and in those days, people knew who their fourth cousins were. We wouldn't have a clue, would we? But back then, people did.
Yes.
And so they knew each other, and obviously the Austens lived in Thomas's, as I said, in the Steventon rectory at Steventon, because George Austen was the rector there, the vicar there. And so they'd known the family, they knew Edward, and I think they just thought that Edward was the right young man, because he was only about 12 at this point.
Wow.
And he was only about 12 when they sort of really started to take a shine to him.
Yes.
And he was 15 when, now the history books will tell you he was adopted. And I just need to make the clarification that obviously the word adopted has more than one meaning. In today's world, we think about it as being the legal transfer of a child from one family to another. But it also means to just take something up, doesn't it? Yeah. You can adopt a new habit. You can adopt and so even though all of the books will tell you Edward was adopted, he wasn't adopted in the legal sense that we think about it now. That's not what it means.
I understand. But they don't say he was adopted into Jane Austen's family, immediate family.
No. Into the Knight family. So when he was 15, he started spending more time with the Knight family. An agreement was reached between the Knights and George and Cassandra Austen that Edward would be the heir. They sent him on a grand tour around Europe, the Knights did, and prepared him to be the squire. He went to university in Germany for a year, and they were really preparing him, because being the squire, that's taking over the family business.
Yes.
You're being trained to be the CEO of a business that has tenants, that has farmland, that has an economy to manage.
Yes.
And so Edward Austen was chosen, but on the condition he changed his name to Knight.
Right.
And now he's my fourth great grandfather.
Got it.
Why I'm a Knight is because he changed his name, and it wasn't just him that had to change his name. All of his children changed their name as well. Wow. Even though they were all adults by the time he inherited, they all had to change their name, so that branch of the family.
I see.
We're Knights. That's how it works.
How fascinating. So that's why I understand you to be saying that Jane Austen was your great, however many aunt.
Great aunt, exactly, because she's Edward's sister.
Understood.
1809, and by the time we get to 1809, so Jane is 33 years old. Her father by this point has died, leaving Mrs. Austen, Jane, her sister Cassandra, and a family friend Martha Lloyd, who's lived with them for years, because in those days single women, if they didn't get married, they often did end up living together just through practical, finances.
Right.
So the Austen ladies, the four ladies, including Martha Lloyd.
Hey everyone, it's Naomi Wolf of Outspoken and Daily Clout, and I want to tell you about gold. Every major financial collapse has been preceded by the same 7 warning signs: before the Great Depression, before the 1970s stagflation, before the crash of 2008, and now all 7 are flashing red again for the first time in over 15 years. American Alternative Assets just released a free report called the Bellwether Signal. It breaks down each of these signals and shows you how to protect your retirement before the next wave hits. In times of uncertainty, gold has always been the ultimate safe haven. It held strong in 2008. It surged during the inflation crisis of the 70s, and it remains one of the few assets not tied to political manipulation or central bank policy. Find out why central banks are buying gold and precious metals in record amounts and how you can too. Call 855-803-GOLD or visit cloutgold.com. That's cloutgold.com to get your free copy of the Bellwether Signal. That's 855-803-GOLD or cloutgold.com. Learn the signs, protect your savings, make your move while you still can.
As we call them, the Austen ladies, they didn't have an income to speak of. They were living with brother Frank in Southampton in very sort of cramped circumstances, and Edward offered them a home, a cottage.
I would have hoped so, right?
And they chose Chawton. He did say they could live in Chawton and Gobisham, and they chose Chawton. Okay. Now, Chawton, which we're talking about, towards the north of Hampshire, Hampshire, however, is right in the south of England. It's got a coastline, on the south of England, but in the north of that county. So about maybe in today's world, probably half an hour from the coast by car.
Right.
And Chawton it's quite close to Steventon. It's only about 12 miles from Steventon. So they would have also been back in familiar Hampshire countryside. They would have been close enough to see childhood friends. Right. I mean, in those days, that was still a distance, but that was a reasonable distance to do in a horsey carriage. That wasn't, an insurmountable. So Jane moved to Chawton, and she moved to Chawton with the Austen ladies in 1809, and they took up residence in Chawton Cottage, which was in the village. And then sort of at the end of the village and up on a hill, that's where Chawton House was, which was her brother's, who inherited it. This, as I said, this big manor house. So she spent 8 years in Chawton. She arrived an unpublished author. She had been early attempts. She had tried, but failed to become published. And as I said, she was 33 years old. And what Chawton really gave Jane was, because they had, for the first time in many years, their own home. Right. She had space and privacy to write. Because when you're in someone else's house, and I've written a book, it's not a 20 minutes here and a half an hour there kind of exercise. No, you need hours and hours of uninterrupted, time to be able to concentrate. And when you're in other people's homes, that wouldn't have been an easy thing. Whereas they finally had that privacy. The way that the Austen ladies lived in the cottage was designed to support Jane's writing. So she was in charge of making, the tea first thing in the morning. She was in charge of making sure she was in charge of the wine cupboard and keeping that locked and stocked, and a few other bits and pieces. But basically, she was actually excused of an awful lot of responsibilities. I mean, they kept various livestock. They were obviously, and Martha and Cassandra, and they were looking after the cooks, and they were looking after their home, and they had a few acres. Right. But Jane was relieved of that.
Extraordinary.
So every day.
Can I jump in and kind of restate a couple of things that are, I'm just absolutely captivated by the chance to talk to you, because already you've said a couple of things. And I have a doctorate in Victorian literature from Oxford. And I've read every single Austen work. And I've read so many, critical volumes about her era and the context in which she wrote, and on and on and on. You've already told me two things I didn't know. And one of them is, or I may have known in very two-dimensional terms, what a profound psychological impact it would have had on a girl. I'm not sure exactly how old she was when her young teenage brother, Edward, was identified by this other family to be groomed to be the heir of this giant microcosm, right? Do you know how old she was at that time?
She would have been 7 or 8, that sort of,
right.
That sort of age.
At a very, like, you're coming to consciousness, here's your brother, here's your other brother. I don't know if she had other siblings, I don't recall.
Yes, she's one of 8. She's
8.
One of 8.
Oh my goodness. Okay. But family life. Then there's this sibling, a boy, who gets plucked out of a vicar's kind of middle class life, right?
Yes.
Like, not super rich, not super poor. And this giant path is prepared for him, magical path. He goes to university, he travels, he has all the things an intelligent young girl would want. And then again at 33, so that's amazing. That must have had a huge impact on her. And then the other thing that you've told me, which is unbelievable, is the geographical location. This was why I was so eager to talk to you, right? Because I think our homes shape us and our towns shape us, obviously. So here she is in a house with some acres. So she's in probably better circumstances than it's her own, sort of, with 3 other women. But even before she's a breadwinner, even before she's famous, renowned, published, 3 other women who are equally obscure believe in her talent so much that they do something that does not come easily to anyone, which is they take over her share of the housework and they clear the decks for her to write. And last thing you told me, which is mind-blowing, up the hill is the giant palatial manse of her brother and all of his domain. So that also is going to have a psychological impact. Is all of that correct, what I just said? And if so, will you say more about the women? How did the women know that they should clear space for Jane Austen's writing?
Well, one of the things I think is absolutely extraordinary is everything that Jane Austen wrote from the age of 12 exists today.
That's amazing.
Now, can you say that about you? I'm guessing no. I certainly my parents didn't keep everything I wrote when I was 12 or 13, whereas everything that Jane wrote from that sort of age, which we call her juvenilia, is actually bound into 3 volumes, and one's in the Bodleian Library in Oxford and 2 are in the British Museum, I think. Pretty sure. And so that in itself, I think, actually is just, that's a clear demonstration that her family were, they knew.
So they bound it. They bound her early.
When she was a child, yes. So when she was living in Steventon, and obviously we're talking about a time before any entertainment in the way that we know it today.
Right.
I mean, of course there were theatres, but I mean digital entertainment. There wasn't electricity even.
Right.
So people entertained themselves or entertained each other by everybody. I mean, that's why you see in Austen's work, somebody can play the piano, somebody else can recite poetry, someone else. That's because that's how they obviously, whiled away the evenings.
Yeah.
And Jane was telling stories from a very, very young age. She was telling stories. She was making up stories when she was a young girl and regaling her family with them. And a lot of the work, so we certainly know that in Steventon, Eleanor and Marianne existed. We don't know how close to Sense and Sensibility the story she had created back then was. We don't have a copy of it, but the characters Eleanor and Marianne are referred to in letters back then.
And just jumping in for people who are not as obsessed with Jane Austen as I am, or a relative of hers as Carolyn is, and so knowledgeable, those are the 2 lead characters in one of her
in her first novel. Her first published novel. Yes, Sense and Sensibility. Exactly. Her first published novel. So Jane was, as I said, regaling them with stories. And in those early days in Steventon, she wrote the first iterations, in whatever iterations they were, of Sense and Sensibility, because we know that she had Eleanor and Marianne. We know that she wrote the first iteration of Northanger Abbey, which was called Susan. And we know that she wrote the first iteration of Pride and Prejudice, which was called First Impressions.
Oh.
So in some form or other, she completely rewrote them when she got to Chawton into the narrative books we know today. And as I said, we don't truly know what the gap is between what she first wrote and then what she rewrote. But those 3 stories all were existing in some form while she was still in Steventon. She then moved to Bath and actually had a very good attempt at getting Susan published, and that failed. And the same with First Impressions. Her father tried to get that published with a publisher, and that failed.
Can I just jump in? Can you tell me what was the reason that those texts were declined when she submitted them initially?
So Susan wasn't declined. Susan was purchased by a publisher. And Jane would have, I mean, she sold the copyright to a publisher for £10, and she would have absolutely believed and probably rejoiced that at last she was going to be published. But the publisher just decided not to publish it. I don't know whether he had a change of direct. I mean, publishers obviously from time to time do, they focus on various types of content that they're going to do. So who knows what happened there? Or I certainly don't know. I mean, there may be academics that have looked into that particular thing that may be able to, but I don't know the details of that. But Jane was very, very frustrated that there was 10, that her first novel, and she'd sold it and she couldn't get it back, and she had no control over that. And get to print. It never got to print in her lifetime. Never got to print. Northanger Abbey. And her father had sent a manuscript of First Impressions, which, as I said, was the first iteration of Pride and Prejudice. He'd sent it to a publisher who just returned it in an envelope, and with no interest. So there was no explanation. There was no that the publisher had read it and had this feedback or anything like that. I do know that one, as I said, was just sent back.
Okay, so we know that her family was impressed and supported.
Absolutely. They knew how, and one of the things that so in history, we do tend to know more about the men than the women. That's just how how things go. So we know a lot more about George Austen than we do about Cassandra Austen. But one of the things that we do know about Cassandra Austen, obviously Jane's mother, that I've always understood, is that's where that twinkling wit comes from.
Really,
that magic that I've always understood. That's a touch of Cassandra. George was a very learned man. He was a teacher. He was a very, he'd been to Oxford, very, and he had a library of 500 books, which for a country clergyman in those days, that was a fine collection. Yeah. But that that whatever it is that Jane's got, came from her mother.
And how do you know that? From letters, from family lore?
Yes, just from, so over the years, various family members. So James Edward Austen Leigh in 1870 wrote the first biography of Jane Austen. And then there's been, a couple of other subsequent ones by the family. And they're included in there that because obviously as Jane was starting to become more successful and well known after she died, but of course as the family began to realize that she really was going to be an enduring author in that kind of way, the people that knew her did start documenting and writing down memories and circumstances and things like that. So about not just about her life, but about life in Steventon, about so it's from there, it's from earlier family records that had been noted.
Amazing. So let's fast forward now, or go back to this extraordinary story. There's Jane Austen living with 3 other women, several acres, meaning some livestock, right? What was her typical day like? Or is there a record of that? And what is the house still there? Does the house is still exists, right?
It's Jane Austen's House Museum now.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So and you say Chawton House, which is your baby. Is that this house, or is that the big house on the hill?
We've got 2 houses.
Okay.
We've got Chawton House, or Chawton Great House, as Jane called it, is the big house on the hill.
Right.
And that's where I grew up, is on the big house on the hill. I had my first 18 years there. Jane Austen and the Austen ladies, and the big house, yes, belonged to her brother, although his actual primary residence was Godmersham Park down in Kent.
Okay.
So Chawton was often, it was leased out for a little while, but to people that they were very friendly with, and Jane, that they still would have been at Chawton House, frequently.
Right.
And then for years it was rented out to one of the Austen brothers had it as well. So again, it's rented out, but by friends and family. So, and Edward visited every year. And one year, him and his family actually came for 5 months, and they were, resident in Chawton House for 5 months. So there were different people coming and going, but obviously because Edward actually wasn't the resident, he wasn't resident in Chawton. Right. The Austen ladies were his sort of representatives. They would have been, that they were the family representatives
in the village.
Yes, but her day, typical day for Jane, would have been obviously, waking up, having, she, as I said, was in charge of what we call breakfast. Meals were slightly different, but what we would call breakfast, she was sort of in charge of that early morning tea and things like that. Once that was over, Jane would then actually settle down and play the piano for an hour or two. And there's a quote from her that's something like that she can't sit down to composition with a head full of doses of rhubarb. And what it sort of means is, if you know what I mean, with the minutiae of the day, and I've always understood that piano playing, and she was a reasonable pianist,
yes,
that piano playing was part of her creative process.
Right.
It was part of her, and I know it's not what she was doing, but I can, I sort of have this silly imagination almost of her, what has become such iconic music from the 95 Pride and Prejudice. And I know that this is nonsense, the piano music that it's at the beginning of the Colin Firth Pride and Prejudice, that is just, if you heard it, is so iconic. And I just, imagine her sort of sitting down and playing the sort of music that, you know what I mean, to get herself in the mood for what she's going to write about.
Yes.
Now, of course, that music didn't exist at the time. That's just what we all know so well. So she would play piano, as I said, for an hour or two. And then she would settle down to write for what we would call for the afternoon. She wrote on a small 12-sided table, which is still at Jane Austen's house in the museum. And it's a very small table for the simple reason that she had to move from window to window as the light moved during the afternoon.
Of course.
So, I mean, that's why the table is so small, is because, again, no electricity. She's following the light.
Following the light.
Yeah. So she would write for the afternoon. And then as the light went, well, that would be the end of writing for the day.
Yeah.
And then obviously it would be into the evening, but as I said, with no electricity. So then that would be the ladies using themselves together in whatever they're going to do that evening. Now, Jane did also spend time. I mean, she did also. Yes, Chawton House was, of course, a huge influence and insight for her, and influence on her writing and learning and things like that. But she also spent time down at Godmersham Park, which is where Edward lived. She spent time. So whilst Chawton was absolutely her home, where she spent most of her time, Jane Austen, actually, she was someone who lived on the edge of privilege.
I was just going to ask about
They knew other people as well. Her mother was from the Lee family, and they had a line that was rich and had a big property. And so there were a few grand houses that she would have spent time in and got that sort of view of the inner workings. But obviously Chawton would have been the greatest exposure she had.
So fascinating. So quick question. The room in which she wrote, was it her bedroom, or was it an actual study, like devoted?
No, it's called the parlor. It's called the parlor downstairs. Yes, it's in the parlor. Now, that's not to say, I mean, of course, we know that because, again, family members at the time left behind written memories of Jane. And so they would have talked about, walking into the cottage and Jane, or now, I mean, obviously, lots of people didn't know Jane was writing. So it depends who it was as to whether they ever would have seen her writing. She was doing that anonymously. But for those who did know she was writing, and therefore that wouldn't be hidden from them, they would see her writing in the parlor on that table. That doesn't mean that she never wrote in her bedroom, does it? It doesn't necessarily define everything she did. That's just what people saw.
And is the house constructed or arranged so that you can actually be pretty undisturbed in that parlor, or are there like maids going back and forth to the scullery and the kitchen? And people, welcoming visitors when they come into that parlor? Is it a room that has any privacy, I guess is what I'm asking.
You can certainly get, no, people would be able to move around that property without going through that room.
Oh, well, that's so important.
That room. I mean, it was, if you were in the sort of main part of the house, yes, you'd walk through it, but you could have just nipped around the back of the house.
The other women could say, like my mom with her dissertation, which she wrote on the dining table, like Jane's working, and then everyone would just read.
Yes, exactly. I'm sure that would have been
incredible. What a revelation. Well, may I reflect on what you've just said to date? Because it brings up so much. I mean, when you said Jane was on the edge of privilege, this resonates so well with the world of her books, right? Because there's so often the plucky young heroines who have so much to offer, but they're living on modest means, and they're kind of barely middle class. They're educated, but they're economically insecure. There's not tons of luxuries. And then the question is, will they be invited? Will other worthy people who may not be to the manor born be recognized for their worth? And will the grand lady or the grand gentleman, from the great houses, have them over, visit them back? It's that there's like two classes, right, in Jane Austen's world. And a central moral question and dynamic in many plots is, will the elite be able to recognize the worthiness of people who are not to the manor born? And also, are the elite worthy, right? Like some of them are, some of them aren't. But there's often a moral test involving how do they treat the insignificant, the meek, the not privileged. And so from what you're describing, I imagine they were in such an interesting social position, right? Because as you said, they were Edward's representatives in town, which is a big deal, right? As you said, it's an enterprise, right? There's farming, there's tenants, there's rents, there's, some obligations socially and economically of representatives of the family to the tenants, the community, the church, etc. So they have quite an important role representing their brother and the family, but also they could have been slighted by, the big house in the next county, or not invited to a certain ball, or overlooked by knight this or lady that.
Absolutely.
So what I just said relevant to, does it align with what you described?
Absolutely. And I also think it's interesting to think Jane lived in a time when your worth was defined by your social class, by the wealth of your family, by your name and things like that. Mm-hmm. And her books challenge that.
They do. Because
her books don't just go with the premise that the people that have all of that are better than the people that don't. And everything you've just said about, in actual fact, it's about moral worth.
Yes.
She's challenging the status quo of, as I said, how that kind of social structure worked in England.
Right.
But she's so cleverly doing it in a way that her work was considered to be suitable reading for young ladies. It was. I mean, it was absolutely, it was good reading. You know what I mean? People didn't know it was her as the author, but it was encouraged reading. Nobody thought her work at the time was controversial in a sort of way that meant that it was going to be dangerous for women to read it, and those sorts of things happen.
Well, it's very G-rated. Yeah, but it's
fact.
Sorry,
she's teaching the ordinary reader to actually think differently.
Totally. And it's not just one way, right? Like in Pride and Prejudice, someone she thinks is really awful, who's kind of well-born, turns out to be not awful, right? So morally.
Absolutely. But even Mr. Darcy has to challenge his own assumptions about what's worthy and what isn't. And does the fact that Elizabeth doesn't have the name, the same sort of social standing that he has, to begin with, that matters to him, because in his first proposal, if you can call it that, he, despite your, I'm proposing to you anyway. Whereas obviously, and he comes around to the realization that those are not the important things.
Right.
And so she is, even in the way she's writing, she is, I mean, I sort of think of it as, and she's still influencing women like that today. She's still teaching us to think for ourselves is what she's doing, but in a way that is so cleverly packaged.
Yes.
No one saw it, if you know what I mean, or the people that wouldn't have liked or wouldn't have encouraged that sort of independent thought of women didn't realize that was what was going on.
It's extraordinary. I'm just jumping in to say you're so right, Ms. Knight, because even though it wasn't recognized as subversive as it was at the time, I mean, that language of, challenging the patriarchy didn't exist, or challenging, the class structure didn't exist, that consciousness didn't exist, in the same way that, like, we don't want to make mistakes by reading backwards with modern sensibilities, right? But Jane Austen's work opened the door. I mean, what people have to understand, I find with my audiences, they're super smart, but our education often leaves us in America, I would say increasingly in Western Europe, without a timeline. And timelines historically and in literary history are so important. So people really have to understand that when Ms. Knight's great, etc. aunt was writing these extraordinary novels, the novel was pretty new. And women writing novels was pretty new. It had been like 2 generations that women had been writing novels. And there were maybe 2 or 3 at the time, public successful women novelists. I believe you'll confirm that. I don't think there were more. The great era of the mid-19th century kind of woman journalist, woman travel writer, woman novelist, Gothic novelist, and so on. They dominated literary production in the middle of the 19th century into the 1860s, 1870s. But at the time Jane Austen was writing, she really would have no reason to believe, not just that she would ever be published, though every real writer believes eventually they'll be published, but she would have had almost no models for a life as a female novelist, successful or not successful. Is that not correct, Ms. Knight?
You're right. There were few. There were a small hand. You Fanny Burney, people like that, who absolutely were successful and well known, but they were writing differently from Jane. I mean, in terms of her, she when I was about 5 years old, I used to say to people that came to Chawton House, because we had the money, my family ran out of money between 1920 and 1950. So it's the same story for all of these ancestral homes. Our story is not unique at all in that. And estate taxes and things like that. In the 1940s, the profits on the estates was taxed at 80% in England.
It's insane.
It got to that sort of. So these estates just had no way of surviving. Sorry, I interrupted your last sentence. What did you say? Just saying, unless they had income from elsewhere, that the estates, because of course you've got estates like Chawton and the Knight family holdings, where their wealth is in the land.
Right.
Whereas you've got other families that may have also been merchants, may have had some other but more often than not, people didn't. They were just landowners. And as I said, that was, as the sort of 19th and 20th centuries, went on, that was, through social change and things like that, and taxes and death duties and all the rest of it, decimated most of the families.
I mean, that seems kind of a direct attack. I've just been reading a biography of Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law, and she goes into this, the 1940s, the post-war era, and the Labour government kind of annihilating the land.
Absolutely.
It seems like such a direct attack on your family's, lineage, heritage, class, whatever. I mean, people call it different things, because how can you possibly sustain a vast estate and a giant historic house on only 20% of the profits?
You weren't supposed to. I mean, the idea was, but you've got to think that at one point, only a few thousand families owned the whole of England, and no one else had the opportunity of owning.
That's not fair,
one of those things that obviously there are losers in that scenario, and my family is one of them. But intellectually, I understand that wealth had to be people, that the rest of the population had to have the opportunity to own their own properties and things. And as obviously the Industrial Revolution and all sorts of things happened, that societies, I have to be pragmatic about.
Well, you're very gracious. I'm
Well,
allowed.
I can't spend my whole life being, but I can't spend my whole life being upset about it.
No. I get what you're saying.
I
guess
I have to rationalize. But when I was just sort of saying that so my grandmother ran a tea room from the Great Hall at the front of Chawton House. So I spent my childhood.
This is an Austen novel.
Yeah, absolutely. So I spent my childhood talking to Jane Austen fans. And at about 5 years old, I used to say Jane was a pioneer. And I used to say it so proudly. I had no idea what the word pioneer meant, but I heard someone else say it, and it sounded so grand because I'd also heard the word sort of associated with explorers, and just I mean, it was a word that I'd heard with these. So Jane was a pioneer, and so that was sort of what I used to say. And she was a pioneer in terms of her style of writing, her, the subject matters that she wrote about. But she wasn't, absolutely, as you say, she wasn't the first female writer. Of course, that had been going on, but as you said, there were only a few. I
would call her the first modern novelist. I really would. Like the language of her contemporaries was so stylized compared with her. My 14-year-old stepson could read Jane Austen. And not because it is an incredibly eloquent prose, but because the story picks up in such a fast-paced, engaging way, and people speak in conversational tones. It's like those stories are eternal because those characters are completely relatable to any interfering teenage girl is going to,
is going to recognize
exactly what's going on, or anyone who's ever had unrequited love. Well, what I was just going to say, it's so adorable, but you were so right as a tiny child to say that she was a pioneer, because what I was going to say is she opened the door to a flood of women writing, and she made it legitimate for women to take seriously women's concerns, right? Who's going to marry whom? Who's going to inherit what? What are you wearing? Did someone snub someone? I mean, these seem like trivial to the male writers of the time, perhaps, and subsequently, but they are worlds upon worlds. They are battlefields before women had any entree into the world apart from through the marriage market. The marriage market itself, which later feminists deconstructed. She was the first feminist deconstructing the marriage market.
Absolutely. She was challenging it and saying, absolutely, it's exactly what she was doing, was challenging. And we don't think about it as extraordinary now, but she was advocating for love, wasn't she? She was advocating for love.
She was,
and that just wasn't part of the equation then when they were thinking about, particularly. I mean, I'm not talking about everyone, but particularly when you're talking about the sorts of families that Jane would have known, who did have status and wealth and things like that. Marriages were, I don't want to say they were business deals, but they were. Yes, exactly, they were. And she was challenging that. And even though marrying for love now is something that we just take for granted, or that's what we all would aspire to, back then that wasn't the case.
1,000%. So with her own private life, did she have any romances? I mean, I know there was very limited scope.
So there's three people just to mention. One is Tom Lefroy. Now, Tom Lefroy, his family had a home quite close to Chawton. And he actually came from, but he was in London, and he came down to stay at this family home for a few weeks, a couple of months, I think. And while he was in the area, Jane and him met because the families knew each other, and they went to a couple of balls together in Basingstoke and things like that. And she certainly wrote to Cassandra some sort of letters about, oh, I've seen Tom again, and they're all sort of fluttering, and she sort of, and there are some people that believe that Tom Lefroy was the big love of her life. I don't believe that myself. I think they clearly, obviously, there was a spark between them, and they had fun at the ball. Right. But I think she was writing to her sister, and everything that she wrote, I think you've got to be very careful in interpreting it as literal. She's writing to her best friend, and even though and even when she's saying my heart's all aflutter, you know what I mean? It's
ironic, yeah.
And interestingly enough, there's a letter years later where they've just been on holiday down to the coast, seaside, and they've met a chap down there. They only met him frequently. And in her letter, she says to Cassandra, "Oh, I'm in love again." I mean, just I mean, I think so. I think we have to be careful around Tom Lefroy, even though he is the name that most people would know. So Montague Knight, I actually, funnily enough, have a first edition here. This is Montague Knight's book from 1913. And he wrote a book with William Austen Lee about Chawton Manor and its owners, a family history.
Oh, wow.
And because I said different branches of the family have owned Chawton, this goes through the different branches. And obviously the last branch is the Austen family. And he says in there that they have it on Cassandra's good authority. But years earlier, when they were still living in Bath, they'd gone to Sidmouth on holiday, and that Jane had met the love of her life there. Wow. And we think he was a clergyman, but we don't know anything else about him. And unfortunately, he died quite soon afterwards. So Cassandra said that it was this mystery man that we just don't know who it was. She did also, when they were in Bath, they visited Manidown House, which was close to Steventon, and to some childhood friends, called the Big Withers, which is always a name that used to amuse me as a child. Big Withers, and she'd been friends as a child with the girls there, and they had a younger brother who was 6 years Jane's junior, called Harris Big Withers. Okay, and he proposed to Jane on that.
He proposed to her. Wow.
And she accepted. So Jane was engaged. But the next morning, and her and Cassandra, if they were in the same house, they stayed in the same bedroom. They shared a bedroom. Right. The next morning, they got up really early and withdrew the acceptance and left.
Why?
So ran away in a carriage.
Oh, my gosh.
We don't know. So Caroline Austen, who I'm, that's Caroline I'm named after, who was Jane's niece. She wrote that Harris was, the way she describes Harris is let's say not attractively, not physically very appealing, and a bit oafish in his manner, and not intelligent in the way he sort of spoke. She just described a man that was not Jane's man.
Okay.
And whether or not Jane would have considered him at this point, she was not a published author. She was still, yes, that was still her ambition. But we don't know if she'd got married. It always amused me as I said when I was younger, the thought of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Big Withers.
Yeah, right. That doesn't work.
But in practice, she wouldn't have been writing.
Yeah. No.
But if she'd accepted that, he was the heir to Manidown House, which is a big manor house. So that would have made Jane, a wealthy, have a wealthy life. That would have meant that her sister and her mother would have been set for life. That would have introduced very useful connections for her brothers and things like that. And for her to actually refuse that was really something.
It's really extraordinary. And again, for historical context, everyone, women couldn't own property in their own names at this time.
No.
They were like the level of dependence that even daughters and, mothers of sons in very otherwise affluent families like this one could suffer was extreme. Women are living at the whim of brothers-in-law, and so on.
Now, there were exceptions. There were women who did inherit properties. It did happen, but you're right. The general women like Jane absolutely had no prospects of ever owning anything.
Right. Well, in our last few minutes, the time has flown. I'm dying to talk about you. And please tell me what it was. That's such a big question, but what are some of your earliest memories of growing up in that house? And when did you start to feel like this is a special house? It is connected to a really important part of British history, and it's my job to bring that forward into the future.
So as a child, there was never a day I didn't know about Jane Austen, that I didn't know I came from, this long lineage and Chawton and all of that. I've known that, I went home from the hospital to Chawton House.
Wow. Wow.
And Granny's tea room was already operating.
Right.
So there were already Jane Austen lovers in our house all through the summer at weekends.
Was the tea room right in the center of the house or off to?
No, in the house, the great hall. You come in the front door and you go straight, and on the left there's a door straight into the great hall. The rest of the house at the time was residential. People were coming into the great hall, and I, as a very young child, I mean, Granny would have been humouring me, but I was in there quite a lot. But then as I got older, that's how my pocket money was working.
That's a wonderful way to grow up, having such an extraordinary house to live in, but also getting to meet people from all walks of life.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also meant, now in those days, because we're talking about the 70s and 80s, it's before the 95 Pride and Prejudice, it's before Colin Firth, it's before all of that. So it's before the modern fandom we see, and there wasn't social media or anything else. So the people that came to Chawton were reading Jane's work in its original text. It was lovers of classical literature that were coming. But because, of course, I mean, even as the youngest child, all these people are coming all the time. Well, that tells you that there's something here that's important, doesn't it? Yeah. So I always knew that, but it never occurred to me as a child. I always knew that we'd lose it. I always knew that when my grandfather died, that was the end. I knew that.
Why? How did you know that?
Because my parents told me. It wasn't a secret. Because we were broke. I mean, it wasn't, or the family, the estate was broke. So it was never a secret.
The agricultural lands,
there wasn't agricultural lands because my grandfather had sold, I mean, as everyone did, sold. Once everything. So I grew up with Chawton House and 24 acres is what I grew up with. And at one point it would have been thousands of acres. Right. And farms and all, I mean, at the turn of the century, by 1900, we owned all but 2 houses in Chawton. And so yes, just sell. And then once you haven't got any more of that to sell, and you've got this big house to maintain with big bills, and you've just sold everything that was generating money for you, you start selling your heirlooms, you start selling stuff. So there's also we still got the portraits and things like that, but there's an awful lot of riches that would have been in Chawton House that are lost, that are gone.
That's really terribly unfortunate for British scholarship and British cultural heritage. Wouldn't like the National Trust step in and say, let's keep all these treasures intact?
Oh, that's not what the National Trust do. The National Trust basically look after properties. But the National Trust also, if the National Trust look after a property, they own the property. You have to give the property to them. And my uncle, thank goodness, so my dad's older brother Richard inherited, and thank goodness he was determined to keep it in the family. So he has found a way, and he still owns it. He still owns it. But growing up there was a mixture of completely normal life. I went to school, my parents worked, we went on camping holidays in the summer. Our day-to-day life was, as I said, there wasn't a lot of money at all. So our day-to-day life was no different from anyone else's who, we weren't poor, we weren't rich. Do you know what I mean? We got by. But my parents, they had to manage money carefully. As I say, everybody worked and we spent. So there was that. I went to the local school. Everything was very normal in that respect. But of course it's not. We're living in this, historical sort of, as part of this huge legacy with Jane Austen there as well. So it was sort of half and half of complete normality. But at the same time, the awareness of this legacy. And as I said, talking to Jane Austen fans all the time, hosting events. I mean, the house was used for the village fete, the horticultural show, the Jane Austen Society of the UK. They used to have their AGM there every year, and 500 people. And actually, one of the things that is a very distinct memory as a child is meeting Americans. Really? Because in those days, the Americans were the only overseas visitors we saw, because the movie thing hadn't happened, social media hadn't happened, and now Japanese, Chinese, I mean, they probably be the top visitors, and then the Americans. But when I was a child, it was Americans. And there's a very particular, which I got used to, I know it's completely harmless, but people want to touch me because I'm related to Jane Austen.
No, I want to touch you. If I were in the same room, I would say, "Can I hug you? Can I hug you?"
And absolutely, and I understand exactly what it is, and it's absolutely fine, but it's a very definite touch. It's not a glancing. That's
Really?
not good enough.
What do they do?
Touch on the shoulder, and then there's just this moment of just gentle, but just do you know what I mean? Just to make it count, so they could, and then it's gone.
Like a gentle pressure? Is that what you're saying?
Just a bit of gentle pressure, just so their hands actually, you know what I mean?
The Descendant.
They want the moment of, connection. And and so I, from a very early age, have known that this isn't about me at all, but I am, in a world where Jane didn't have any children, in a world where obviously, she obviously is long departed, for ardent Jane Austen fans, of which there are a lot, and I understand why she is so close to their heart. But I understand that, as I said, for them, I understand why it's happening. I understand why people, want to touch me. I do understand.
It's nice
as a child. That was not. I never found it threatening. I understood exactly.
It's nice of you to give them the benefit of the doubt. I can imagine that having strangers in your family's living room and growing up to have people just want to touch you all the time would be, some people wouldn't handle it that as graciously as you.
Well, thankfully it wasn't a daily thing. I mean, I'm really, like when the Jane Austen Society AGM happened and there was about 500 people, there'd be loads of people from America would come for that. And it was those days that you just knew it was going to happen. And from time to time in the tea room, it would happen. I mean, I don't mean literally, I was walking around my daily life with that happening.
Do you also get this? Don't people clasp a hand of yours in both your hands and gaze intently into your eyes?
Yep. Absolutely. I've probably done, I mean, I've lost count now, but let's say I've done between 150 and 200 events in the last, few years. At least 50% of them, somebody will be in tears when they're talking to me.
I'm in tears right now.
And it's not, again, it's not me. That's because Jane touches us all.
I know. I understand. I do understand. And again, you're very modest and you carry your legacy with, incredible, graciousness, right? But even just talking to you and the electricity, and I hope everyone watching this feels it, great writing is magical, right? There's something that descends through you, through this camera, through our words, just even invoking your ancestors. We're not even quoting her, right? There's some essence she brought into the world from another dimension, probably of, platonic perfection. And it descends to us and it cannot be killed off. And so that's the Jane Austen note in the world. And it just I'm literally getting chills throughout my body, just even thinking about that. And it's beyond the logical, right? So that she struck it and you're kind of bringing that vibration forward and your work is. So thank you. Is there something you want to say before we go on to how we?
So I was actually just going to say that, sort of having had that childhood, when we lost Chawton House when I was 18, my grandfather died, and my uncle Richard inherited, and we'd always known, he was my father's older brother, we'd always known that there was no way that it was going to remain as a family home.
I lost
and I have to say, I was so upset, so devastated by the loss, that I strode off in the opposite direction, determined that I was never going to have anything to do with it ever again. I didn't want to go back there. I didn't want to read Jane Austen again. I just didn't that was my 18-year-old response to the loss of it all, was I'm not doing it.
Yeah.
But I was determined that I was going to be successful independently. I didn't want a rich husband. Silly idea that was, but anyway, if you know what I mean. I rejected any sort of thought of, I did not want to be relying on anyone else. I wanted to choose when I moved house. That's what, you know what I mean? I wanted to be.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So I went off and I formed a career in business, as you sort of referred to at the beginning, and spent 25 years sort of in the corporate arena. But then the 200-year anniversary of Pride and Prejudice, the publishing of Pride and Prejudice in 2013. So by this point, I'm 43. That just started a whole chain of sort of thoughts and events in my life that literally within a month, I'd resigned from a CEO job of a big marketing agency here and decided, absolutely, I want to reconnect with this heritage and I'm circling back to a question you asked me something a while ago, was this sense of what I now have is a huge sense of responsibility.
Mm.
I know that I have a first-hand, experience, I know that I'm connected to Jane.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I know that when I'm gone, when my family are gone, this last 50 years of knowledge of Chawton House, of following some of the same traditions that Jane would have done, of sitting at the same dining table, we ate off the same china as Jane, I'm looking at some of the same books in the family library. We were playing Snapdragon in the Great Hall. We were doing things, which, of course, even though I'm not in any way suggesting that my life was the same with Jane Austen's, of course it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that, there are ancestors that we both would have known about and shared and both call family. The fact that they're, and I know that once I'm the youngest, I was the youngest in the house, and I'm 55 now.
Wow.
So, once it's gone, which is why I am sharing it, preserving it, because I think it not only is this part of Jane Austen's story and part of the Jane Austen family heritage, sort of trying to capture that, but it's also part of, it's sort of a social study of, we all think of these grand houses while they're thriving, don't we?
Yes.
But actually, what happens when they're not? What's that like for the family? What is the practicalities of when things are crumbling? And that happened in houses all over England. So absolutely. So now you asked about sort of the sense of responsibility. As a child, I had absolutely none. I had absolutely no concept at all that whilst I knew I was part of it, I had no concept. I had no thought at all that there was that I should share it, or that there was anything that's come in much more recent years.
Right.
That.
Wow. Well, that all makes perfect sense. So it sounds like it's up to all of us to help you make sure that Chawton House and your family's legacy in this form survives forever, right, into the future of civilized people and readers. How can we help you? You've got this new initiative, you're doing events, you've got a literacy foundation.
I do. So we've also, and thank you for asking. So there's sort of two different ways that people can get involved if they want to. One is that, of course, creating archives and documenting things it costs money to do it. It does. And whilst I have this amazing heritage, the family hasn't earned money from Jane's work since the very, very early 19th century. So there's no royalties. There's no money that comes with that.
What happened to the copyright? The family doesn't own the copyright? It's in the public.
All the copyrights expired in 1841. It was a really short. I mean, now it's 70 years after an author's death, certainly in England. Right. It wasn't then. Yeah. So there hasn't been money. I mean, as I said, Jane Austen's the work doesn't generate anything. Anyway, so all I'm saying is people can so they can support that work. If people were to look at my website, which you can just find through carolinejaneknight.com, that's not difficult, carolinejaneknight.com, then you can see that people can actually join as a member. They can join as a member to support the work. But what they get in return is every single week, I write a story that will be something from the archive, or it'll be a memory, or it'll be, so you're actually sort of getting, a first look at, and I share photographs and artifacts and traditions and all sorts of things. The other thing, which is a slightly different mission, I have to say, it is a different mission. But as you said, I also started the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation. And that's very much about the fact that I just thought, again, if there are literally millions of people that love Jane today, she was an advocate for education. I'm sure I'm going to be able to, harness some of that passion to make a real life difference to children today, to reading today. So I was actually in America in October launching the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation North American Friends. So we are now an American registered charity, so people can get tax relief on that. And actually volunteer on a local basis to support our literacy mission. It really depends on what people are interested in, if you know what I mean.
And what is the website for the foundation, the Literacy Foundation, where you donate?
Jane Austen LF for Literacy Foundation, NAF,
Okay.
Jane Austen, LF.NAF.org.
All right, you guys, she's too well bred to say it, so I'm going to say it. I'm a brash American. Saving this heritage and bringing it to millions of new readers or making them better readers is something that should matter to all of us. So if you're thinking about what to do for the world for Christmas or Hanukkah or the holidays, go to one of these websites. You get the culture you support. I say this to my audience over and over. It's not just you, Carol and Jane, don't worry. And so you've got to support this project. It's utterly important. And then one day you may be able to go, right, to visit this extraordinary house.
Well, it'll be digital. And sorry, the archive will be digital, so people will be able to do it that way. And as you said, Chawton House is open to the public. And it is amazing. I know I'm biased, but it is a beautiful.
I'm going to show up at your door. Literally. Hi, remember me? I'm going to.
And it's the sort of place that you can just imagine Jane. You can see it's no surprise when you get there that that's where Jane lived and that's where she wrote her books. The whole estate.
So exciting. But you guys, we need the archive. We need it digitized. You'll be able to see these treasures from your computer if we help her with this incredibly important project. And don't leave it for universities or national governments to take care of these archives. They don't have the money anymore. They don't care. They don't take good care of them. It's up to people like the heroic descendant of Jane Austen that we've been so privileged to talk to, Carolyn Jane Knight. Carolyn, thank you. If there's anything else you want to share, do so. Otherwise, I'm going to say goodbye to you, and I'm going to remove you from the stage so I can thank our sponsors. But what an honor to have spoken to you, and I wish you every success. I'll post this, and I'll encourage people to keep supporting your work.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's been lovely to talk to you.
You two have a wonderful rest of your journey, holidays, all of it. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. You guys, this was so amazing. I can't get over it. You guys, tear the phones out of the hands of your teenagers. Tear them out of the hands of your teenagers. Put your own phone down. Pick up a book. Pick up an Austen novel. Pick up a classic. Pick up a book. We've stopped reading. And when we stop reading, we dial down the magic in our lives. When we stop reading novels, great novels, we're reduced to this dumb moment in history and this stupid dimension. Let's protect civilization. It takes all of us. We can't, as I said at the end of that interview, we can't just leave protecting civilization to the libraries and the universities and, government agencies. They're not going to do it, or they're going to pervert civilization, or they're going to use it for their own agendas. It's up to us. So support this incredible work and pick up Sense and Sensibility. Pick up Pride and Prejudice. If you've never read Jane Austen or any of the Victorian novelists, it's not beyond you. Trust me, if you have high school reading skills, you can read them. If it seems hard at first, by page 10 or 15, you'll be hooked. You'll be used to it. I'm begging you, it's going to change your life. It's going to make you more lovable. It's going to make you more civilized. It's going to be better for your marriage. And you'll be a better parent if you read Jane Austen. And you'll have many profound things to talk about. So I want to thank our sponsors. Every major financial collapse has been preceded by 7 warning signs. And that was before the Great Depression this happened, before the 1970s stagflation, before the crash of 2008. And now today, all 7 are flashing red again for the first time in over 15 years. American Alternative Assets just released a free report called the Bellwether Signal. It breaks down each of these signals and shows how to protect your retirement before the next wave hits. In times of uncertainty, gold has always been the ultimate safe haven. It held strong in 2008. It surged during the inflation crisis of the 1970s, and it remains one of the few assets that is not tied to political manipulation or central bank policy. Find out why central banks are buying it in record amounts. By the way, China is buying it in record amounts, trying to hoard it. That should wake you up about how important it is, and how you can too. Call 855-803-GOLD or visit cloutgold.com. Again, that's cloutgold.com, CLOUTGOLD.com. Write it down, make a note to get your free copy of the Bellwether Signal. That's 855-803-GOLD or cloutgold.com. Learn the signs and protect your savings. Make your move while you still can. Brian and I talk about this all the time. We talked about it in our podcast yesterday. If we had invested in gold when we first heard one of these ads 5 years ago, we would have nearly quintupled our investment in 5 years. What other asset is doing that? And silver is moving equally, well, maybe not equally strongly, but also strongly. So those are our sponsors. If you care about our independent journalism, our incredibly exciting interviews, our no holds barred conversations, and our own work at Daily Clout and over on Substack's Outspoken, to hold the powerful accountable, to bring you real facts that are hidden or censored, and to give you digital tools that let you pass laws and stop laws from your phone, right? And find out what's really coming down the pipeline legislatively. All that takes money, as you heard. So please help me. Go over to dailyclout.io and donate or subscribe. Come over to Substack, to Outspoken, and please become a free or paying subscriber. If you can afford to be a paying subscriber, it's incredibly useful because we are now in the top 1 or 200, top 10 in some countries, podcast for news commentary, this very podcast, in countries like Russia, Nigeria, Indonesia, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the US, it's just at 235. Canada, I think, is 195 today. And, Germany, France, Argentina, we're breaking through all over the world to government censorship, despite government censorship and propaganda. But it really requires resources to get this truth all over the world. So please dig deep. If you can send me a Christmas gift, do it. Send Daily Clout a Christmas gift or a Hanukkah gift. Please do so. And I thank you for listening. And remember, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe, share, like, really helps us. And otherwise, just please share these interviews, these podcasts. That helps us as well. Enjoy them. I love you all, and I will talk to you tomorrow. This is Naomi Wolf with Outspoken.